Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I came home from work one day and found my sister's stuff all over my house. Clothes in my closet, her makeup in my bathroom, even her cat lounging on my couch like he owned the place. I had no idea what was going on until she waltzed in like she had moved in. No warning, no asking, just took over my house. But if she thought she could stay for free, she had another thing coming. The moment I stepped into my house, something felt wrong. It wasn't just a small off feeling. This was full-body alarm bells ringing in my head type of wrong. The front door wasn't locked, which was impossible because I always double-check it before leaving. Every single time. Then I saw it, a pair of women's shoes by the door. I froze. I don't live with a woman. I don't even date anyone right now. My mind immediately went into overdrive. Had someone broken in? My heart pounded as I scanned the rest of the entryway. My coat was missing from the hook, but a different jacket, a fluffy pink monstrosity that I instantly recognized, was hanging there instead. My stomach dropped. No, no way. I moved cautiously down the hallway, every sense on high alert. The air smelled different, vanilla, and something floral like perfume. As I neared the living room, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of Netflix playing. I stopped just before rounding the corner, took a deep breath, and stepped into the room. And there she was, Emily, my sister, sitting on my couch, in my house, watching some trashy reality show with a takeout box in her hand like she'd lived here for years. Her cat, a smug-looking orange tabby named Machi, was curled up on my favorite blanket, making himself comfortable like he owned the place. The coffee table was covered in stuff. Her purse, a half-empty can of soda, crumpled napkins, and a mess of my mail that she had apparently just gone through like it was hers. The worst part? My fridge was wide open. Half the shelves were practically cleaned out, and judging by the empty takeout containers scattered around, she had been on a full-course meal marathon. Emily looked up when she noticed me standing there. Instead of explaining herself, or even acting remotely guilty, she just smiled like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Oh hey, you're home." I just stared at her. My brain refused to process what I was looking at. "Well, what are you doing here?" I finally managed, my voice coming out slower than I intended, because what the actual hell? She barely even reacted, just shrugged and kept eating. My lease was up. Thought I'd crash here for a while. "Hope you don't mind." "Hope I don't mind?" I blinked, then blinked again, waiting for some kind of punchline, some kind of explanation that would make this less insane. But she just turned her attention back to the screen, stuffing another bite of noodles into her mouth. My hands clenched at my sides. I was 1 second away from losing it, but I forced myself to take a breath. Not yet. Instead, I walked over to the couch and plucked the remote right out of her hand, shutting the TV off with a decisive click. Now I had her attention. Emily frowned at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "Dude, what the hell?" I pointed around the room. "Emily, why are you here?" "I just told you," she said, rolling her eyes. "My lease ended. I didn't have time to find a new place, so I figured I'd stay here for a bit." "For a bit," I repeated slowly. My patience was hanging on by a thread. "When were you planning on telling me this?" She waved a hand. "I dunno. I figured I'd let you know when I saw you." My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "Emily, you move into my house without asking. That's not okay." She groaned like I was being dramatic. "Oh my God, chill. It's not a big deal. You have so much space here. It's not like you even use the guest room." "That's not the point." I nearly shouted, throwing my hands up. "You don't just move into someone's house without asking. That's not how this works." She crossed her arms, looking completely unfazed. "Well, I'm here now, so..." I took a slow, measured breath because if I lost my temper now, she would just dig her heels in harder. Instead, I changed tactics. "Okay, so, how long are you planning to stay?" Emily stretched like she was actually getting comfortable. "Dunno. A couple weeks? Maybe a month? We'll see. We'll see." "Oh, hell, no." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Emily, you can't just decide to live here without talking to me first. I have my own life, my own routine. You can't just barge in and take over." She actually laughed. "Wow, you are such a control freak. I knew you'd be uptight about this." I stared at her, dumbfounded. She had just moved into my house, was eating my food, using my stuff, and she was acting like I was the crazy one? I took another deep breath. "You can stay for one night. After that, we need to talk about a plan, because this..." I gestured at the absolute chaos she had already unleashed in my house. "This is not going to work." She rolled her eyes again, but at least she didn't argue. Yet. But I knew my sister. She wasn't going to make this easy. And in that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. She had moved in without asking. I was going to make damn sure she left the same way. I woke up the next morning, hoping, praying, that maybe this had all just been some weird, overly casual misunderstanding that she would come to her senses about and start packing up her things. But when I walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, it became painfully clear that Emily had no intention of leaving. There she was in my oversized hoodie, feet propped up on my coffee table, eating the last of my cereal straight from the box like she had lived here for years. She didn't even glance up when I walked in, just lazily pointed to the coffee pot like I was some kind of hotel staff, and muttered, "I made a fresh pot, but we're out of creamer." I stood there for a moment, staring at the sheer audacity of it all, trying to decide if I should explode right then and there, or if I should at least try to be civil for a little longer. I took a slow breath, deciding on the latter. "Emily," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, "I thought we were going to talk about a plan today." She finally looked up, chewing in a way that made it very clear she wasn't taking this seriously. "Oh yeah," she said, stretching like she had all the time in the world. "I was thinking I'd check out a few places this week, but I have a bunch of stuff going on, so it might take a little longer." "A bunch of stuff going on? What did that even mean?" I crossed my arms, trying to keep my patience intact. "Emily, I need a real timeline here," I said as evenly as possible. "You can't just stay here indefinitely." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might actually get stuck in the back of her head. "God, you're acting like I'm some kind of burden," she huffed. "It's just for a little bit." I clenched my jaw, inhaling sharply through my nose. That was the first time she said it. It would not be the last. Days passed, then a week, then another, and with every passing day, her behavior became more and more unbearable. It wasn't just the entitlement that got to me. It was the complete and utter lack of respect for my space. My once clean house had become a war zone of dirty dishes, piles of laundry, and random beauty products strewn across every available surface. I would come home after a long day of work only to find that my living room had magically transformed into her personal hangout spot, complete with snacks, blankets, and her cat scratching at my furniture like he had just signed a lease. Then came the strangers. At first, it was just one or two of her friends stopping by, people I barely recognized from high school, who greeted me like I was the guest in my own damn home. Then it was entire groups of people I had never met, lounging on my couch, eating my food, drinking my beer, and acting like they belonged there. One night, I came home to find some guy I had never seen before sitting at my kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone like he owned the place. When I asked him who he was, he barely looked up and said, "Oh, I'm with Emily." That was the moment I realized that if I didn't do something fast, my house was going to become a full-blown frat house, and I would be the one stuck paying for it. I confronted her that night. I walked into the living room, turned off the TV, and waited for her to finally acknowledge my presence. She looked up, visibly irritated, like I was interrupting her relaxation time. "Dude, what now?" she groaned. I took a deep breath, gripping the remote so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Emily," I said, my voice slow and measured, "you need to find your own place." She let out the most dramatic sigh I had ever heard and flopped back onto the couch like I had just told her she had to walk across the country on foot. "Ugh, you're so uptight," she whined. "I literally have nowhere else to go." I narrowed my eyes. "You mean you haven't even looked for another place?" She threw a pillow at me, which I barely dodged. "Of course I have," she snapped. "But it's hard, okay? Rent is insane right now, and I don't have time to spend all day searching for an apartment when I have other things going on." I crossed my arms. "Like what, exactly?" She hesitated for one fraction of a second before coming up with an answer. "Like work. And, my social life. And Machi. I can't just abandon him while I'm looking for a place." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how utterly ridiculous she sounded. "Emily, you moved into my house without asking. You can't just live here forever." She sat up and fixed me with her most pathetic, manipulative, wide-eyed look. "Come on," she said, her voice dripping with fake innocence. "We're family." There was the family card. I should have seen it coming. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. If she wanted to play the family card, then fine. I'd handle this like family. I didn't tell her that I was already formulating a plan. I didn't tell her that this time I was going to win. I knew that if I wanted to get Emily out of my house, I couldn't just demand that she leave because she would dig in her heels and make the whole thing 10 times harder than it needed to be. I had learned over the years that my sister thrived on conflict, and if I gave her something to push against, she would push back harder, refusing to budge out of sheer stubbornness alone. If I told her to pack up and go, she would suddenly have 1,000 excuses as to why she couldn't, and she would find some way to make me the villain in the situation. So instead of going straight for the fight, I decided to be smarter about it. I was going to make her want to leave. I started by playing the long game, keeping my frustration under control and pretending like I was totally fine with her staying for as long as she needed. I told her I understood that finding a new place was stressful, and I even went as far as offering to help her settle in so that she would believe I was actually on her side. The moment I acted like I was totally fine with her invading my space, she let her guard down, thinking she had won. She started getting even lazier about finding her own place, stretching out on the couch with a satisfied look, convinced that she had secured a rent-free situation for the foreseeable future. But while she was getting comfortable, I was working behind the scenes to make sure she wouldn't be staying much longer. The first part of my plan was to get her out of my bedroom, because she had started treating my space like it was hers, leaving clothes draped over my chair, makeup scattered on my dresser, and even her cat curled up on my pillows like he had claimed the bed for himself. I casually mentioned that I was planning to do some renovations in my room, repainting the walls, rearranging furniture, maybe even installing new flooring. I acted like it was no big deal, but I told her it would be easier if she moved all her stuff into the guest room, so she wouldn't have to deal with the mess. She agreed without a second thought, completely unaware that she was taking the first step toward moving out entirely. The moment she relocated her stuff, I started slowly packing things up behind her back, little by little, moving her clothes, books, and random belongings into boxes and storing them in the garage. I did it carefully so she wouldn't notice, starting with things she rarely used, gradually working my way up to the things she actually cared about. She didn't even question it, assuming she had just misplaced things or that her mess had gotten so out of control that she couldn't keep track of her own stuff. Once her things were packed away and the guest room was officially her space, I started implementing the next phase of my plan, which was making sure she didn't get too comfortable. I slowly started cutting off all the luxuries she had been enjoying since she got here, making my house feel less and less like the rent-free paradise she had been treating it as. First, I made sure that the food situation changed. I stopped stocking the fridge with the snacks and meals she liked, buying only the things I knew she wouldn't eat or that required actual effort to cook. If she wanted something to eat, she would either have to go out and get it herself or make something from scratch, which I knew she wouldn't want to do. Then I changed the Wi-Fi password, pretending that there had been some kind of internet issue and that I needed to reset everything. I made a big show of acting like I was frustrated about the whole thing, telling her that the company was giving me a hard time about reconnecting the network. Of course, my phone and laptop still worked perfectly fine, but as far as she knew, there was no Wi-Fi available for her to stream shows or scroll through her endless social media feeds. She whined about it at first, but when she saw I wasn't budging, she started going out more, spending time at coffee shops and friends' apartments, just so she could have access to the internet. And then, the final touch, the thing that really started pushing her toward the edge, I turned off the hot water. Not completely, of course, because I still needed a shower, but every time I knew she was about to get in, I would conveniently be in the middle of a long, steaming hot shower, using up all the hot water before she could even step foot in the bathroom. If she tried to shower at night, I would claim that there was an issue with the water heater and that she would have to wait until morning for it to warm back up. Slowly but surely, she started getting more and more uncomfortable, and I could see the exact moment it started sinking in that maybe staying here wasn't as fun as she had originally thought. She started getting irritated about the smallest things, complaining that the house felt stuffy, that she didn't have access to her usual luxuries, that she didn't understand why I wasn't being more accommodating. Every time she whined, I would just nod sympathetically and tell her that I totally understood how frustrating it must be, all while secretly watching my plan fall perfectly into place. It wasn't happening all at once, but I could tell that she was cracking. The house that had once felt like a free vacation was starting to feel like a prison, and she was desperate for an escape. And that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't need to tell her to leave. I just needed her to come to that conclusion on her own, so that when the moment finally came, she wouldn't fight me on it. She thought she had outsmarted me by moving in without permission. She had no idea that I was outsmarting her right back. I knew that the discomfort I had been creating was starting to get to her, but I also knew that Emily was stubborn enough to stick it out longer than I wanted if she thought she could outlast me. The gradual inconveniences had made her irritated, but they hadn't yet driven her to pack up and leave, which meant I needed to escalate things if I really wanted her gone. She had already gone from lounging around like she was on an extended vacation to grumbling about how the house didn't feel as welcoming as she thought it would, but she still wasn't in a hurry to find a new place. She was waiting me out, thinking that I would eventually cave and let her stay indefinitely, so I had to make sure she understood that this wasn't going to happen. One morning, After yet another night of her taking over the living room and leaving a disaster in the kitchen, I decided to see how she would react if I pretended to help her find a new place. I casually mentioned over breakfast that I had come across a really affordable apartment across town that I thought she might be interested in, and I even offered to take her to see it later in the afternoon. I was expecting some resistance, but I wasn't expecting her to shut me down immediately without even considering it. She barely looked up from her phone before muttering, "I'm fine here." Fine here? Okay. If that was how she wanted to play it, then it was time for phase two, and this time, I wasn't going to be subtle about it. The next morning, I started my day at 6 in the morning, which was a full 3 hours before Emily usually woke up, and I made sure she didn't get to sleep in. I banged pots around the kitchen like I was preparing for a full Thanksgiving meal, made as much noise as humanly possible, and even ran the blender for no reason other than to be as loud as I could. When that didn't fully wake her up, I took it a step further by cranking up the vacuum cleaner and deliberately vacuuming right outside her bedroom door. The sound was deafening, and after about 5 minutes, she came stumbling out of the guest room with a look of absolute murder on her face. "What the hell are you doing?" she groaned, rubbing her eyes like she was recovering from a hangover. I gave her my most innocent look and said, "Just getting an early start on the day. Thought I'd do some cleaning, since the place has been getting a little messy lately." She scowled at me, but didn't say anything else, instead retreating back to her room and slamming the door. I had expected her to fight back harder, but I wasn't done yet. The next few days, I made sure that the house was as uncomfortable for her as possible, from playing the most obnoxious music I could find at random hours to conveniently deciding that I needed to rearrange furniture while she was trying to relax. But the best part? I started leaving passive-aggressive notes everywhere, little reminders that my house was not meant to be an extended-stay hotel. On the fridge, I taped a note that said, "Guests buy their own groceries." On the bathroom mirror, I left another that read, "If you use the last of the toilet paper, replace it." My personal favorite, though, was the one I left taped to the guest room door. "Long-term guests pay rent." This isn't a hotel. At first, she ignored them. Then, she started grumbling about them, muttering under her breath about how I was being passive-aggressive instead of just talking to her. And finally, after about a week of constant pressure, she snapped. One night, after I had accidentally unplugged the Wi-Fi router while she was in the middle of a video call, she came storming into the living room with the angriest look I had ever seen on her face. "Why are you acting like this?" she demanded, crossing her arms like a petulant child. I just smiled at her, because I knew I had finally gotten under her skin. "Just trying to help, sis," I said in the most innocent voice I could manage. She glared at me like she wanted to throw something, but I could tell that the wheels were turning in her head, that she was starting to get the message. She still hadn't admitted defeat, but I could feel that she was close, and that was exactly what I wanted. What she didn't know was that I had one last trick up my sleeve, and this time, it was going to seal the deal for good. I knew that Emily was reaching the end of her patience, but I also knew that she was too stubborn to admit defeat unless she had absolutely no other choice. She had already started acting more irritable, slamming doors, sighing dramatically every time she had to wash a dish, and making pointed comments about how I had become really weird ever since she moved in. She was clearly frustrated, but she still wasn't leaving, and that meant she still thought she could ride this out until I finally gave up and let her stay indefinitely. I couldn't let that happen, so it was time to make sure she had no choice left but to leave. I spent an entire evening researching how eviction notices were supposed to look, studying the language, formatting, and legal jargon used in real notices, so I could craft something that looked legitimate enough to scare her. I carefully put together a document that included official-sounding phrases like "notice of unlawful occupancy" and "failure to vacate will result in legal action." I even added a fake case number and a section that cited made-up property laws to make it look official. The cherry on top was a warning that she had exactly 7 days to vacate the premises, or I would have no choice but to escalate the matter with the authorities. The next morning, I woke up early, printed out the notice on thick, professional-looking paper, and slipped it into a plain, white envelope. I left it sitting on the kitchen counter, right next to her coffee mug, knowing that she wouldn't be able to resist opening it the moment she saw her name printed on the front. Then, I sat back and waited for the fireworks to begin. It didn't take long. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone, when I heard the sound of paper rustling from the kitchen. A moment later, there was a pause, a long, silent pause, before Emily suddenly came stomping into the room, the eviction notice clutched in her hand like it was a death sentence. Her face had gone completely pale, her eyes scanning the document like she was still trying to process what she was looking at. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, shaking the paper in front of my face like I didn't already know exactly what it said. I kept my expression completely neutral, barely looking up from my phone as I shrugged casually. "It's an eviction notice," I said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Her mouth dropped open, then snapped shut, then dropped open again. "You're kidding, right?" she finally said, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. "You can't evict me. I don't even pay rent." I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Exactly," I said smoothly. "That means you're a squatter. And if you don't leave, I'll have no choice but to call the cops and have them remove you from the property." The way her face drained of color was one of the most satisfying things I had ever witnessed. She looked completely and utterly stunned, like the reality of the situation was only just now sinking in. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. "You wouldn't actually call the cops on your own sister," she finally said, though there was an edge of doubt in her voice now. I tilted my head and gave her a long, thoughtful look, like I was really considering her words. Then I pulled out my phone, unlocked the screen, and started scrolling through my contacts. "I don't know," I said, my voice calm and even. "I guess that depends. Are you planning to leave in the next 7 days?" Emily's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The anger and disbelief in her eyes were quickly replaced by something closer to panic, her brain racing to come up with a way out of this. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, glancing back down at the notice like she was hoping she had somehow read it wrong. "You're seriously doing this to me?" I didn't say anything. I just waited. And then, just like that, the fight went out of her. She slumped onto the couch, running a hand through her hair, muttering to herself about how unfair this all was. "I can't believe this," she grumbled, shaking her head. "You're actually kicking me out?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. "Emily," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible, "you moved into my house without asking. You've been eating my food, using my space, bringing random people over without permission, and making no effort to find your own place. What exactly did you expect me to do?" She didn't answer right away, just sat there looking completely deflated, like the weight of her own actions was finally pressing down on her. I could see the gears turning in her head, the realization slowly settling in that she had pushed too far and that she had no choice left but to actually do something about it. After what felt like an eternity, she finally let out a long, frustrated sigh and flopped back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. "Fine," she muttered, her voice dripping with resentment. "I'll figure something out." That was the moment I knew I had won. I didn't gloat. I didn't rub it in. I just nodded, stood up, and walked past her toward the kitchen, leaving her sitting there with the fake eviction notice still clutched in her hands. She had no idea that the whole thing was a complete fabrication, no idea that I had never actually filed anything, no idea that if she had called my bluff I wouldn't have been able to do a damn thing about it. But she had believed it, and that was all that mattered. I had known, deep down, that Emily was never going to leave quietly, but I hadn't expected the sheer level of dramatic theatrics that would come after she realized she had truly lost. From the moment she processed that the eviction notice was real, at least real enough that she believed it, she went from angry and indignant to completely desperate, flipping through every emotional manipulation tactic she had ever used before. She wasn't just going to accept defeat and walk out the door with her belongings like a normal person. No, she was going to make it as painful as possible for me, dragging out the process and making sure I felt like the absolute worst person alive for daring to kick her out of a house she had never even been invited into in the first place. At first, she started with pure rage, standing in the middle of the living room with her fists clenched, her face red, and her voice shaking as she unloaded every insult she could think of. She accused me of being selfish and controlling, of being the kind of person who didn't know how to have a normal sibling relationship, of being an absolute monster for not letting her stay when I had so much extra space in the house. She ranted about how ridiculous I was being, how no good brother would ever do this to his own sister, and how I clearly didn't care about family at all if I was willing to treat her like this. I let her vent. I let her shout. I let her throw every accusation she could think of at me without reacting, because I knew that this was just her first stage of grief. If I had taken the bait and argued back, she would have just doubled down, stretching this fight into something even bigger than it needed to be. Instead, I simply leaned against the counter with my arms crossed, watching as she paced back and forth, waiting for the inevitable moment when she realized that her tantrum wasn't getting her anywhere. Sure enough, after nearly 10 minutes of nonstop ranting, she switched tactics so fast it almost gave me whiplash. The anger vanished almost instantly, replaced by something so pitiful and dramatic that I might have actually fallen for it if I didn't know her better. Her shoulders slumped, her face crumpled, and suddenly her voice was soft and broken, like she was barely holding back tears. "What am I supposed to do now?" she sniffled, glancing up at me with big, watery eyes that had gotten her out of trouble so many times before. "I don't have anywhere to go. You're really just going to throw me out like this? What if I end up on the street?" She let that last part hang in the air, like she was waiting for me to feel guilty enough to backtrack on everything I had just said. I could see the hope flickering in her expression, the confidence that I would crack under pressure and let her stay just a little longer, maybe long enough that she could start pushing my boundaries all over again. Unfortunately for her, I had prepared for this exact moment. I raised an eyebrow and tilted my head, making sure to keep my face completely unreadable. "That cheap apartment I found for you?" I said casually, watching her eyes narrow slightly in confusion. "I already paid your first month's rent." The shock on her face was almost comical. Her mouth dropped open slightly, her eyes darting to the side like she was trying to process what she had just heard, like she hadn't even considered the possibility that I had already solved her biggest problem before she could even finish weaponizing it against me. "You what?" she finally choked out, blinking rapidly as if she was trying to reset her brain. I shrugged, still playing it cool, knowing that I had just thrown her entire plan off course. "I put down the deposit last week," I continued, keeping my voice as nonchalant as possible. "The landlord said you can move in any time. All you have to do is pack your stuff and go. No need to worry about being on the street." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, completely deflated, the reality sinking in that she was officially out of excuses. There was nothing left for her to argue about, no guilt trip she could throw my way, no way to make me feel bad enough to let her stay. The eviction notice had scared her. The inconvenience had worn her down. And now, with the realization that she already had a place waiting for her, she couldn't even argue that she had nowhere to go. She had lost. I watched as she struggled to figure out how to respond, her brain racing through possibilities before finally settling on a half-hearted attempt at pretending she had been planning to leave anyway. She let out a deep sigh, like she was the real victim here, like she was doing me a favor by accepting the inevitable. "Fine," she muttered, her voice heavy with irritation. "I guess I'll move in, since you already paid for it." I resisted the urge to laugh at how hard she was trying to save face, knowing that pointing it out would only make things worse. Instead, I just nodded, watching as she turned on her heel and stormed off toward her room, probably to sulk for the next few hours before actually starting to pack. The war was finally over. She was leaving. And most importantly, she had no idea that the eviction notice had never been real in the first place. Moving day arrived with the kind of tension that made it painfully obvious that Emily was still furious about the entire situation, but she wasn't going to waste any more energy fighting a battle she had already lost. From the moment she started dragging her belongings into the hallway, she made sure that I knew just how much she resented me, throwing sharp, pointed sighs in my direction, muttering complaints under her breath, and stomping around as if she was being forcibly exiled from the only home she had ever known. She packed slowly, deliberately taking her time, probably hoping I would suddenly change my mind at the last minute and tell her she could stay after all, but I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. I simply leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as she stuffed her clothes into bags with unnecessary aggression, shoving things into boxes like the process of leaving my house was causing her physical pain. She refused to ask for help, which was honestly a relief, because I didn't think I could handle carrying her stuff while she pouted like a child who had just been told she couldn't have dessert. She wanted me to feel bad, wanted me to regret my decision, wanted me to offer her some kind of last-minute compromise where she could stay just a little longer, but I wasn't falling for it. She had spent weeks turning my home into a personal crash pad, treating me like an unwanted landlord in my own house, and the only thing I felt in that moment was pure, unfiltered relief that this nightmare was finally ending. Even when she had packed up most of her things, she still found ways to drag out the process, stopping in the middle of the living room to complain about how ungrateful I was, how I didn't appreciate how good I had it, how I was going to miss her once she was gone. I didn't even bother responding anymore, because what was the point? I had won. She was leaving. The tantrums, the guilt trips, the ridiculous attempts to manipulate me into letting her stay had all failed. And now she was left with nothing but the bitter reality that she had never actually been entitled to my space in the first place. By the time she finally hauled the last of her bags out to her car, she was radiating pure resentment, throwing one final glare in my direction before slamming the trunk shut with a little too much force. I stepped outside, watching as she lingered near the driver's side door, hesitating for a moment like she was waiting for me to say something. Maybe she thought I would soften at the last second, tell her that we could forget the whole thing, invite her back inside for one final sibling bonding moment where I assured her that none of this had been personal. But I just stood there, silent, waiting for her to finally accept the inevitable. She huffed, rolling her eyes like she was the one being inconvenienced, and muttered, "This is so messed up. I can't believe you actually did this." I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Take care of yourself, Emily." She scowled, opened the car door, and got in without another word. A few seconds later, the engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the driveway like she was trying to make some kind of dramatic exit. But I didn't even flinch. I just watched as her car disappeared down the street, waited until I couldn't see her anymore, and then turned around to face my house. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Walking back inside, I took a moment to just stand in the silence, appreciating the complete and utter stillness that had been missing since the day she had arrived uninvited. No more dirty dishes stacked in the sink. No more random shoes cluttering the hallway. No more strangers lounging on my couch like they owned the place. No more mooching, whining, or freeloading. My house was mine again, and the weight that had been sitting on my shoulders for weeks finally lifted. Of course, just because she was gone didn't mean she was actually letting this go. It took less than 24 hours before she started whining about me in the family group chat, painting herself as the tragic victim of the cruelest eviction in history. She made vague, passive-aggressive comments about how some people clearly didn't care about family, how certain siblings had forgotten what it meant to help each other, how she was struggling now because I had been so heartless in kicking her out before she was ready. She never mentioned the part where she had moved in without asking, or the part where she had taken over my home like it was hers, or the part where I had literally found her a new place and paid her first month's rent to make sure she wasn't struggling. I saw my mom try to mediate, dropping little messages about how we should work it out and not let this come between us, but even she wasn't fully on Emily's side. Other family members chimed in, most of them carefully avoiding taking a stance, not wanting to get involved, but I noticed that a few of our cousins actually called Emily out, pointing out that it was insane of her to think she could move into someone's house without permission and then act like the victim when she was told to leave. She mostly ignored those messages, doubling down on the sob story, trying to make herself look as pitiful as possible, but it didn't really work. At the end of the day, everyone who knew the real story understood exactly why I had done what I did. She had taken advantage of me, refused to leave when asked, and then had the nerve to act like I was in the wrong for finally forcing her out. And the best part? She never realized that the eviction notice had been completely fake. For a few glorious months after Emily was finally out of my house, life felt peaceful in a way I hadn't even realized I had been missing. I no longer came home to find random people sitting on my couch, eating my food, or blasting music at full volume like they had paid rent to be there. I no longer had to tiptoe around my own space, worried that I would somehow be interrupting Emily's chaotic version of daily life, which mostly consisted of lounging around while making vague excuses about why she wasn't looking for a job or a new place to live. I no longer had to deal with her cat leaving fur all over my furniture, knocking things off my shelves, or using my belongings like they were his personal playground. The fridge actually stayed stocked, the Wi-Fi wasn't being drained by someone watching videos all day, and I could sit in silence without the constant noise of her existence pressing in on me. For a while, I barely heard from her. Aside from the occasional passive-aggressive rant in the family group chat, she seemed to have moved on, and I had no intention of reaching out to check in on her after everything she had put me through. Every once in a while, I would get a text from our mom, usually vague comments about how Emily was adjusting or how she was still figuring things out, but I didn't bother asking for details. As far as I was concerned, my role in Emily's life had ended the moment she walked out of my house for the last time. Then a few months later, karma finally caught up to her. It started with a random phone call from my mom, the kind of unexpected middle-of-the-day call that immediately made me think something must be wrong. I answered, half expecting it to be something serious, but the moment she spoke, I knew exactly where this conversation was going. "Did you hear what happened to Emily?" she asked, her voice carrying that same exasperated tone she had always used whenever Emily managed to get herself into yet another mess that she couldn't get out of. I leaned back in my chair, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense was coming next. "No," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What happened?" Mom let out a long sigh, like she wasn't even sure where to begin. "She lost the apartment," she said finally, and despite how much I had been expecting something like this, I still felt a tiny flicker of satisfaction at hearing the words spoken out loud. It turned out that Emily had done exactly what I had predicted she would do. She had taken full advantage of the free month of rent that I had so generously paid for, but instead of using that time to find a job or set up a stable plan for herself, she had done absolutely nothing. She had continued living like she was still crashing at my house, spending money on takeout, partying with friends, and scrolling through her phone all day like the concept of paying rent simply did not apply to her. And when the landlord came knocking, expecting actual money for the apartment she was living in, she had no way to pay up. She had tried to convince the landlord to give her more time, throwing out every excuse in the book about how she was in between jobs and just needed a little more flexibility. But apparently, they weren't nearly as patient as I had been. When it became clear that no money was coming, they kicked her out immediately, leaving her with nowhere to go. She had called our parents first, probably assuming they would welcome her with open arms and let her move in without consequences. But for once, they had actually put their foot down. They told her she needed to figure things out for herself, that they weren't going to bail her out every time she made bad decisions, and that she needed to start acting like an adult. She had no backup plan, no savings, and no options left except couch surfing between friends' apartments, crashing with whoever would take her in for the night while burning bridges along the way. I let out a slow breath, letting the reality of the situation settle in. "That's rough," I said, though my tone was anything but sympathetic. There was a brief pause, and then my mom finally got to the real reason she had called. She asked me if she could move back in with you. The moment those words left her mouth, I actually burst out laughing, because of course that was her plan. After everything she had done, after all the tantrums, all the manipulation, all the ways she had tried to make me feel like the villain for kicking her out, she actually had the nerve to think that I would let her move right back and like nothing had ever happened. "She seriously thinks that's an option?" I asked, still chuckling. Well, my mom hesitated, probably realizing just how ridiculous it sounded out loud. She said she thinks enough time has passed, and that maybe you've calmed down about everything. That only made me laugh harder. The delusion was almost impressive. After a moment, I finally caught my breath, shaking my head as I reached for my phone. "Tell her she can come over," I said, my voice casual. My mom sounded genuinely shocked. "Wait, really?" "Yeah," I said simply. "Tell her to text me." I could tell she was surprised, but she didn't argue, just told me she would pass along the message. About an hour later, I got a text from Emily, and I could practically hear the forced casualness in her words, the way she was trying to act like this wasn't a big deal. "Hey, so crazy question, but is your guest room still open?" "Oh." I stared at my screen for a long moment. Then, without hesitating, I typed out the only response that felt right. "Ugh, you're so uptight. We're family." I hit send, and didn't even bother waiting for her reply. Safe to say, she never asked again.